Hello YouTube! In this video I want to present some of the ideas on moral philosophy from the work of the Marquis de Sade. Now, before we get into this, it's important to note that interpreting Sade is no easy matter. This is largely because he presents his ideas in the form of novels rather than as direct, carefully structured philosophical arguments. He would put his ideas into the mouths of his characters, and not all of them shared the same views. Moreover, it's unclear to what extent Sade intended his work to be taken seriously. The arguments in his books might be intended as satire, or they might be just, an aspect of the libertine fantasies, a tool to shock and break taboos in order to enhance the pornographic excitement, rather than as arguments to be taken as serious expressions of his own actual position. So, as I say, it's a bit difficult to interpret him. Nevertheless, there are certain themes that occur regularly throughout his work. In particular, many of Sade's philosophical arguments aim to defend a position we might call immoralism. And this involves two claims. First, moral nihilism, which is the view that morality is groundless. Morality is a fiction. There are no moral constraints on our actions. There is no good reason to act otherwise than in your own self-interest. Now, moral nihilism in itself may not be all that controversial these days. There are plenty of philosophers who think that morality is constructed, not discovered, or that morality is not justified by reason or whatever. But second, Sade argues that it is in each person's self-interest to act contrary to accepted moral norms. The best way to maximize pleasure for myself is to commit crimes and violate the accepted moral code of my society. Torture, rape, murder, incest, paedophilia, these are all advocated at length in Sade's work. It is by imposing pain and suffering on others that I achieve the greatest pleasure for myself. Okay, so we'll take these one at a time. Sade's central argument for his moral nihilism rests on an appeal to nature. So he thinks that he can justify the rejection of morality by appealing to his views about metaphysics and human psychology. So let's begin with this. Sade was heavily influenced by the developments in science of his time, such as Newtonian mechanics, and on the basis of this he defends a thoroughly materialist, mechanistic worldview. There is no God, no spirits, no afterlife. There is only matter in motion, governed by strict natural laws, and humans are nothing more than machines constructed out of material parts. The whole world, essentially, is a massive machine, and humans are just parts of this machine, not fundamentally different from any other parts of it. In Juliette, Sade gives a couple of simple arguments against the notion that humans have immaterial souls. He says there are two roles the soul might play, right? There are two reasons we might postulate the notion of an immaterial soul. We might postulate it as an active principle, which as far as I understand, is supposed to underlie the body's animal movements. It's what makes the body, animal bodies, distinct from inert matter. So, the distinction between a rock that just sits there versus a body which moves of its own accord. Or we might postulate a soul as the thinking principle, the crucible of mentality, of consciousness. In neither case, however, are we justified in supposing that there is anything immaterial here. First, Sade argues, that which is divisible is material, but the soul as active principle is divisible, as demonstrated by the fact that certain organs will continue to function for some time after being removed from the body. For instance, there are animals for whom the heart will continue to beat after it has been removed. Even in humans, you can find muscles that will continue to jerk after being removed or whatever. It's not as though once you remove some part of the body, it just immediately becomes inert. So the active principle, the principle that drives the movements of the body, is divisible. And that makes it material, at least as Sade sees it. What about the thinking principle? Well, here, Sade argues, that which is subject to degeneration is material. But consciousness, and the mind in general, is negatively affected by changes in the body. So the very young and the senile in those people, the thinking soul is correspondingly weak. As the body declines, the soul similarly deteriorates. It shares in the changes of the body. So we see a correlation between the material body and the soul. But since the soul undergoes degeneration, it must be material. Moreover, Sade adds, since the soul changes with the body, since it develops and degenerates, it must, like the body, be composed of changing parts. And again, that means it must be divisible. So again, by the first argument, what underlies thought, the thinking principle, that must be material as well. So the reasons why we might have for postulating an immaterial soul, well, actually it turns out that both of these can be seen to be material. They are divisible, they are subject to degeneration, just like other material things. Now, Sade is not only a strict materialist, he's also a determinist. As he sees it, all objects are governed by laws, all events are determined by earlier events plus the natural laws. And from this, Sade denies that humans have free will. The idea of free will requires that we are the cause of our own decisions and actions, but he thinks this is compatible with materialism. As Sade writes, and I quote, "All our ideas owe their origin to physical and material causes which operate upon us independently of our will, because these causes result from our intimate organisation and from the impact external objects have upon us. In the moment when the decision is taken, it is not we who determine it, it is enjoined upon us." So he says, look, we have this feeling of freedom, we have this feeling of free will, and he thinks this arises from those moments in our life of indecision, right? Like where we deliberate about what to do. So I can sit down, I can think, and I can be unsure about what the right course of action is. I can deliberate about it, and then eventually I come to a decision, and it seems like it's me making that decision. But he says, this is analogous to having kind of scales in our minds, finely balanced, right? When we're in the condition of indecision, it's like having finely balanced scales in our minds. What is it that ultimately tips the scales? Well, it must be either external objects impinging upon us in some way, or the movement of matter within us. And all of this is determined by strict law outside of our control. So there's not really any free will there. There's perhaps the feeling of free will, but that's an illusion. The human mind is fundamentally no different from any other material phenomenon. So just as a person with full knowledge of the motions of particles could predict the location of the planets in 100 years' time, so they could predict with perfect accuracy human behaviour. Our future is fully determined. So whatever actions we happen to take, they're not really within our control. We have no power to do other than what we actually do. Now, as Sade sees it, this deterministic materialism has two important consequences. First of all, since nobody has any control over their actions, it makes no sense to take them to be beholden to moral norms. There are no grounds for punishing any crimes, nor for feeling any kind of guilt or remorse at any of your own actions. I mean, after all, why feel guilty? That would only make sense if you could have done otherwise, but you can never do otherwise, right? So for Sade, in the materialist deterministic world, there can be no moral responsibility. And I suppose, this is a fairly intuitive position, right? After all, we already take it that certain circumstances can mitigate responsibility for crimes. If a person receives a blow to the head and sustains serious brain damage, we would say that they have diminished control over their own actions. I mean, this is just the kind of thing that people already will argue in court, right? Like where we're trying to determine who is responsible for particular crimes. Like once we've identified the person who has actually committed the crime, the defence might then make the further argument that they have diminished responsibility, maybe because of brain damage, maybe because of their upbringing or whatever. But Sade is going to say, well, what's the fundamental difference between this person's condition and ours? In both cases, the action that a person takes is ultimately a product of material forces outside of the control of the individual, right? Like the more we learn about the causes of people's actions, the more we tend to see them as having diminished responsibility. And if you had perfect knowledge, if you knew all of the causes, there would be no way of assigning responsibility at all. The second important consequence of materialism is that it entails a world without values, a world without any objective good or bad. So even if the notion of free will and responsibility could be made coherent, we have no way of grounding the idea that it would be better or worse to bring about any particular state of affairs. So even if you are responsible for what you do, you can't do anything bad, right? So there just are no moral values. Nature, as Sade sees it, is an endless cycling of creation and destruction, of material things transforming into new material things. And nature has no preference for life over death, or for pleasure over pain. Indeed, all of these things play essential roles in the operation of nature. New entities only come into being through the destruction of the old and through the transformation of their matter. Sade says, "Murder is no destruction. He who commits it does but alter forms." So death, destruction, pain, suffering, these are all part of the productive capacity of nature. New things can only come into being through the death and destruction and suffering of the old. So these things, right, death, suffering, pain, they can't in any sense be in conflict with nature. Again, by destroying one thing, you just supply nature with the raw materials to create anew. If creation is good, so must be destruction. These are just, these are just part of the blind material processes, the transformation of matter. Now, humans erroneously regard themselves as the foremost of nature's creations, right? So in religious worldviews, you often get a kind of hierarchy of beings, a great chain of being, with God at the summit and inanimate matter at the bottom. Humans sit at the peak of the great chain in the natural world. Humans are kind of created in the image of God, so they are above the plants, animals, and minerals. I suppose you have like the rocks and minerals at the bottom, and then you have plants, and then animals, and then humans. Human life is divinely inspired, and hence it is precious. This is what makes the destruction of human life unacceptable, whereas the destruction or transformation of a rock is banal. Indeed, the world was created for humans in these kinds of worldviews, and so in this worldview, we may use otherworldly resources as we see fit, right? Like, it's perfectly fine for a human to take a rock and transform it into something that benefits them. Humans, again, the world was created for humans. Humans were created in the image of God. It makes sense for humans to use the world in ways that they see fit. But from the point of view of a materialist metaphysics, there can be no grounds for such a hierarchy. Man is an animal. He is a machine formed from the same elements as every other thing. He has a life cycle governed by the same natural laws as every other thing. And the creation of a human being is no more difficult for nature. It imposes no greater cost on nature. It's no more special than the creation of a plant or a rock. Nature uses the same materials and the same laws in both cases. And the human is formed from the destruction of other bodies, and then with the destruction of the human, new things will be created in turn. So where in all of this is the special value of a human life, Sade asks. He says, every form is of equal worth in nature's view. And by destroying the human, you just open up the possibility of creating entirely new creatures and forms. And where could be the problem in that? Similarly, nature has no preference as regards the desires or feelings of any individual. The desire of the sadist's victim not to be injured are of no more importance than is the desire of the sadist to inflict injury, right? Like, so if I'm stabbing you, your desire that the stabbing stop is of no more importance than my desire to continue the stabbing. So here Sade seems to invert the usual appeal to a kind of view from nowhere. Philosophers have long grappled with the question of how to respond to the egoist. The question is, why shouldn't I act entirely in my own self-interest without regard for the welfare of others? Right? Why should I act morally? And a common response to this is to say, well, if you act entirely in your own self-interest, that is to, in a way, privilege your interests above the interests of others. But there's no relevant difference between yourself and others that would justify this preferential treatment. From from the point of view of the universe, as it were, you are not more special than anybody else. You can see that suffering is unpleasant, right? You wouldn't want to suffer, and so since there's no reason to privilege your desires, you shouldn't impose suffering on others. But Sade kind of turns that argument on its head, right? So he says, well, nature has no preference at all, right? Once we take up the view from nowhere, there's no reason to treat pleasure as the favoured state, so that we should act so as to bring about pleasure in others rather than pain. When I impose a great agony on another person to gain the slightest amount of pleasure for myself, it's arbitrary to suppose that it is my pleasure that should cease, that my desire for pleasure should be sacrificed to satisfy the other person's desire to be free from pain. After all, both the pain and the pleasure are mere movements of particles. Pain is bad for me personally when I'm undergoing that pain, but another person's pain need not be bad for me, and it certainly isn't bad for nature in general. So ultimately, Sade says, there is nothing by which nature is offended. All men equally her womb's issue, during their term have acted not at all save in accordance with her impulsions. And we act as is determined by her laws. Again, we could not do otherwise anyway, but even if we could, there is just no grounds for supposing that any particular state of affairs is better or worse than any other. Okay, so if this is all right, then there's going to be no way to ground moral rules in nature. The materialist world is a world without objective rules or values. But we might think, okay, that's all fine, but there are still other ways of justifying morality. In particular, a popular approach in Sade's time, and still highly influential to this day, is social contract theory, contractarianism. This approach does not assume any particular metaphysics, and it attempts to ground moral norms in self-interest. Now, Sade grants that self-interested action is perfectly rational, so social contract theory offers an obvious response to his moral nihilism. According to social contract theory, our moral obligations arise from an agreement, a contract among ourselves and others concerning the right rules upon which to organise society. And in particular, the usual way that contractarians will approach this is that moral rules are those rules that would maximise the self-interest of each person, provided everybody follows them. So this is the kind of idea you find in people like Hobbes. Contractarians often imagine a hypothetical state of nature in which no moral rules exist. In this state, resources are scarce and people have competing desires, which obviously leads to conflict. If you have some clothes and I like your clothes, well, there's nothing to stop me just killing you and taking them. In this situation, nobody can trust anybody else, and nobody can really cooperate with anybody else because, even if I would benefit from working with you now, as soon as the balance of advantage changes, as soon as you gain some resource that I desire, I can betray you, and vice versa. I know that under any, change of circumstance, you might betray me. In this state of perpetual conflict, life is, as Hobbes put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But the situation is not hopeless, because, humans are rational. We have rational capacities, and each of us can reason that, okay, look, rules, that if we all adopt rules that constrain our behaviour, right, this will make all of us better off, provided everybody else follows the same rules. So certain rules respecting property rights, as long as everybody's following those rules, that makes all of us better off. It's in my self-interest and in your self-interest for all of us to follow those rules. Now, yes, by following such rules, my own behaviour is constrained. So if we adopt a system of property rights, for instance, well, I can no longer just take what I want from others. But the other side of the coin is that provided that everybody else constrains their behaviour similarly, this protects me from the depredations of others. And it also creates the possibility of trade, industry, other forms of cooperation that can raise my standard of living. So it's in my self-interest to respect the property of rights of other people, provided they respect my property rights. And this is the case even if I have relatively little property, because a world in which I have very little property but my rights over it are protected, that's still better than a world in which at any moment I might be victimised by a stronger person. So another example that I think helps to make this intuitive, if there is a field that everybody likes to visit, but because so many people are using the field, it is being degraded, we might then come to an agreement, okay, each person uses the field only once a week. Now this limits my liberties, because it means that I can no longer use the field whenever I want, so in that respect my actions have been constrained, but it also means I get greater enjoyment of the field overall. It means the field will just continue to exist indefinitely, and I can enjoy it in more limited cases, once a week rather than every day. It's in my self-interest to live in a world in which everybody follows this rule, rather than a world in which everybody just does whatever they want in the moment. Okay, so for the contractarian, morality is a human construction grounded on the self-interest of the contractors. It is in my self-interest to consent to a world in which we all follow certain rules. I accept some constraints on my liberty because this makes me better off in the long run. That's the basic idea of the social contract. And all of that works even within a thoroughly materialist metaphysics. Now, Sade gives a number of responses to social contract theory. First of all, Sade suggests that the contract on its own terms is unjust. It's not really in the interests of most people, at least, to consent to it, because other people do not obey it and never intended to obey it. He says that powerful people agreed to the scheme, and I quote, "not in order to prevent their own class from pillaging the weak, but to prevent the weak from despoiling one another, so that they, the powerful, could despoil the weak more conveniently." As Sade sees it, the social contract is a tool used by those in power to more effectively control the weak. It doesn't prevent theft, it just allows theft to be channeled along more efficient lines. It allows merchants to sell goods at prices above their intrinsic values. It allows sovereigns to impose taxes and levies. It allows property owners to control labour, perhaps as leftists would say today, to extract surplus value. It allows land, which once may have been in common ownership, to be stolen from the people and sold off to private individuals, etc. The contractarian will tell you, hey, consent to this contract and the meagre property you have will be protected from theft. But in fact, no such protection really exists. Indeed, not only will things under your control be stolen from you, but you are in a sense even more at risk than you were before, because your adversaries will be that much more powerful. Nothing as powerful as a modern government or a private security force exists in a state of nature, and the theft that exists under the social contract is backed up by this much stronger adversary. The powerful benefit from the social contract, partly because it prevents the weak from fighting amongst themselves, which makes them a more efficient labour source, and partly because by convincing the weak that they are better off under this system, it prevents them from banding together to fight the powerful. Sade says that the weak would do much better by turning to crime, fighting to take what they desire, and perhaps in that way making themselves stronger. But assenting to the social contract, they give up much more than they are assured. Second, a social contract can exist only between people of relatively equal standing. So in a way, this is kind of the converse of the previous point. The point of the social contract is that it is in my interest to protect myself from violence. But since those who are weaker than me can pose no threat to me anyway, well, I have no good reason to make any sacrifices to them. Like, why should I sacrifice my interests to those of, like, an infant, for instance? What's an infant going to do to me? I mean, like, it doesn't raise any kind of challenge to me. It's not going to steal anything from me. If I like to cook and eat infants, why shouldn't I just go ahead and do that? So, as Sade says, the necessity mutually to render one another happy cannot legitimately exist save between two persons equally furnished with the capacity to do one another hurt. I would be a fool to sacrifice my own interest to those who cannot hurt me. Now, throughout Sade's works, you can find libertine characters acting within criminal organisations rather than as lone wolves. These organisations often have quite strict codes of conduct. So in principle, Sade has no objection to the idea of reciprocal cooperation to maximise mutual self-interest. He has no objection to the idea of people following rules and constraining their behaviour according to those rules because it's in their self-interest to do so. But he says this just doesn't ground any kind of universal concern for humanity or universal constraint on behaviour, because you need not cooperate with everybody. Indeed, it will often be beneficial if you exclude people from the contract so that you can use those people as resources for your pleasure. After all, consider all of the incredible achievements that have involved exploiting other human beings. Would the construction of the pyramids have been possible without the brutality of slavery? Or consider all of the medical knowledge that was built by conducting non-consensual experiments on prisoners and orphans. So, strong, rich, intelligent people benefit from working together to exploit the weak. This is what we might call the sadistic contract, right? In a sadistic contract, the contractors agree to constrain their behaviour with respect to each other because they recognise that it is in their self-interest, but the contract excludes large classes of people, those who are taken to be weaker. The weak have no grounds to expect the strong to make any sacrifice at all for them. It may well be in my self-interest to work with other strong people to exploit the weak. The sadistic contract can achieve the same ends as the social contract. It protects me from violence, it facilitates cooperation, allows for trade, allows for more intimate forms of social interaction, it reduces the risks involved in particular ventures by allowing risks to be shared, and so on and so on. But additionally, unlike the social contract, the sadistic contract enables us to pursue our criminal desires, to victimize others, as we are inspired to do by our natural urges. For the libertine, the sadistic contract, which allows for unlimited cruelty to those who are excluded from it, is surely preferable. So, it's not that contractarians are mistaken in their analysis of the benefits of cooperation. It's that cooperation only goes so far. And of course, again, right, Sade will say that, as a matter of fact, the sadistic contract is what actually obtains, right, in our society, right? That's what's the way that our society is actually structured, is that the powerful, right, will indeed violate the social contract in order to exploit the weak. So, in fact, powerful people will work together to exploit the weaker. That is the condition under which we actually live. So again, right, in terms of the theory, right, theoretically, the justification for the social contract really only gets you a sadistic contract, and as a matter of fact, society is organised according to a kind of sadistic contract. Sade's third argument is that social contract theory just fails to give an account of morality. Basically, he says the social contract theory misses the point. If there were a purely self-interested reason for complying with a moral norm, this would not be a moral reason. Now, of course, we all recognise, we all acknowledge that people can comply with moral norms for non-moral reasons. You could prevent me from torturing somebody by putting a gun to my head and telling me that you'll shoot me if I lay a finger on them. Well, in that case, I'll leave them alone. And so I'm acting in compliance with the moral norm not to torture people. But obviously my motivation is non-moral. So, Sade sees a strict distinction between moral and merely prudential reasons. The social contract, right, even if you grant the contractarian everything she wants, even if Sade's previous two arguments don't work, the social contract is merely prudential. It is explicitly a matter of maximising self-interest. As Sade says, "It is not at all owing to virtuousness that, believing myself, let us suppose, the strongest of the band, I do not use a dagger on my comrades in order to appropriate their shares. It is because, thereupon finding myself alone, I would deprive myself of the means which assure me the fortune I expect to have with their help. Even if there were circumstances where it would be prudent to cooperate with everybody, not just those of equal strength, this wouldn't generate any moral norms, because virtue must be more than mere prudence." So, there you have it. That is the case for moral nihilism. There are no moral rules, no moral values. And this shows, at the very least, that there can be nothing wrong, nothing morally wrong with sadism. I cannot be blamed for engaging in the most brutal cruelties. But Sade goes further than this. He argues that it is in my self-interest to do so. Now, the usual kind of argument here is that even putting aside morality, there are very good reasons, good prudential reasons, to behave in accordance with, you know, what we might think of as moral conventions, right? Like an entirely self-interested, amoral person would, in general, still behave kindly to others. They would want to avoid murder, torture, theft, even if they could sometimes get away with it. You will live a richer, more fulfilling life by cultivating virtuous character traits, by cultivating benevolence and sympathy and compassion, and acting kindly to others. And perhaps the most shocking parts of Sade's philosophy are his arguments against this. Sade argues that behaviour that is contrary to accepted moral norms is more pleasurable, that there is a greater intensity of pleasure in cruelty, sadism, destruction, and breaking taboos. Now, Sade's arguments here again draw on his materialist metaphysics. So, Sade is a hedonist, right? He takes it that people are driven to experience pleasure and to avoid pain. So he's a psychological hedonist. Of course, there are many things we desire, many activities in which we wish to engage, but what unites all of our desires is that we expect these things to bring us pleasure, or at least to increase the pleasure that we currently feel. We want pleasure, and the greater the intensity of the pleasure, the better. Now, as we have seen, Sade views the human body as a machine, and he has a rather simple picture of the biological mechanism of pleasure. Pleasure, he says, is caused by irritation of the senses. There are certain events that impinge upon my body, or certain movements of atoms that occur in my mind when I undergo thought, and this can result in the movement of atoms throughout my body and my brain. The more intense these movements, the more intense is the pleasure. Sade says, "What is pleasure? Simply this, that which occurs when voluptuous atoms, or atoms emanated from voluptuous objects, clash hard with and fire the electrical particles circulating in the hollows of our nerve fibres." Now, of course, hedonism is not exactly an unusual view, but Sade's hedonism is very simple. So again, you know, for Sade, it's this pleasure is just this kind of purely mechanical process, and a relatively simple mechanical process where, like, the more vigorous the movements of voluptuous atoms, the more intense the pleasure. Moreover, for Sade, there is no distinction between higher and lower pleasures. So traditionally, there are many people who have defended hedonism, who have argued that certain forms of pleasure are more worthwhile than others. In particular, the intellectual pleasures, such as the pleasure of acquiring knowledge or of contemplating art, are more worthy than the mere sensuous pleasures of food and sex. As Mill famously put it, "'Tis better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." An unhappy human, just by virtue of their more refined cognitive faculties, is still better off than a content pig. Unsurprisingly, Sade sees no grounds for ranking pleasures in this kind of way. All pleasures are the result of blind mechanical processes. There is no ultimate meaning, no purpose underlying any activity. There is nothing in the world that makes art and knowledge a more worthy pursuit than food and sex. The only way we can measure pleasures is by their intensity and duration, by their purely mechanical properties. So, humans are motivated to experience the greatest possible pleasure, and for this, we need to provoke the most intense, most vigorous movements of voluptuous particles. The greatest possible pleasure is achieved by, and I quote, "exposing our nervous system to the most violent possible shock." Now, an important aspect of this is our observations of the experiences of others. When other people experience sensations, and we observe this observation has an effect on our own nervous systems. So, pleasure can be produced by observing or inflicting strong sensations on objects of beauty. Again, Sade has a very simple mechanical model of this. The intensity of my own experience is directly correlated with the intensity of the experiences I observe in others. And, I mean, to be fair, this is something we're all familiar with. If you see somebody else laughing, this will prompt you to laugh. If your partner is visibly writhing with sexual pleasure, this will enhance your own pleasure. As Sade might put it, the voluptuous atoms are excited more vigorously in our interactions with other people. But now Sade argues that the greatest possible shock to our own nervous systems comes from the infliction of pain on others. So yes, we are moved by giving pleasure to others, right? If I'm having sex with somebody and I see them writhing in pleasure, that will enhance my pleasure. But, Sade says, I will be moved all the more violently by the infliction of pain. We react more strongly to observing or inflicting pain on others than to observing or giving pleasure to others. This is because, Sade says, there is no more lively sensation than that of pain. Its impressions are certain and dependable. They never deceive, as may those of the pleasure women perpetually feign. So Sade makes 2 points here, right? First of all, pain in others produces a greater intensity of sensation in that person. This is because pain is always more extreme than pleasure, right? Like, imagine the most intensely pleasurable sensation you've ever had. Now, would you take 5 minutes of that most pleasurable sensation in exchange for 5 minutes of the worst, most painful sensation you've ever had? I think most people would refuse that offer. I mean, I certainly would refuse that offer. Like 5 minutes of the most intense pleasure really would not be worth taking 5 minutes of the most intense pain. In any case, pleasure has a rather annoying tendency not to last very long. I mean, the pleasure of orgasm, say, will last, like 10 or 20 seconds, whereas pain can just kind of continue and just be horrible for extended periods of time. If you have some terrible injury, right, it will just be agonizing torture for as long as that injury lasts. But so generally speaking, right, people, even if you could have a 5 minute long orgasm, would it be worth 5 minutes of the worst pain, the worst suffering you've ever had? Again, I think a lot of people would refuse that. Pain always tends to impress itself upon us more strongly than does pleasure. We're more strongly motivated to avoid pain than we are to acquire pleasure. And of course, this expresses itself directly in our behaviour. When I'm in serious pain, I'm going to make that fact known. I will do anything to stop it. And the intensity of my action will directly impact the nervous systems of any observers. Thus, Sade says, the shock resultant upon us by the impressions others experience will necessarily be more vigorous if the impression those others receive be painful. To inflict pain will, again I quote, will more energetically resound in us, will put the animal spirits more violently into circulation. Because pain has greater intensity, this means that the pain of another person can produce a greater intensity of pleasure in me. The second point Sade makes here is that pain is more reliably and more easily inflicted than is pleasure. Producing pleasure often requires a great deal of effort, especially if you're talking about sexual pleasure, and when Sade is talking about pain and pleasure, it is generally in sexual contexts, because there is, at least as Sade sees it, no greater intensity of pleasure than sexual pleasure. But yeah, producing pleasure requires a lot of effort, especially if we're talking about sexual pleasure. For many people, in order to experience sexual pleasure, the context and mood has to be just right. There are many things that might turn people off. And indeed, there are some people, particularly many women, who are incapable of orgasm from penetration alone, right? They're going to need further clitoral stimulation, for instance. Pleasure also requires physical attraction, so some people will just be unable to provide pleasure to others. Sade says that to give a woman pleasure, the man must exhibit self-confidence, youth, vigour and health. Many men lack those qualities, and I think it reasonably goes the same. It's true the other way round, right? Like, to give a man sexual pleasure, it certainly helps if the woman is youthful and is healthy and so on. And moreover, even in the best of circumstances, I can never really know if somebody is experiencing pleasure, because the signs of pleasure are so easy to fake. And in sex, it is common enough for people to fake it. It's so yeah, like pleasure is difficult to provide, and you can never really know if you've succeeded in providing it, even if you try your absolute best. By contrast, consider pain. pain is easy to inflict. It doesn't matter if you're old and ugly. Indeed, being old and ugly will probably help increase the suffering. As Sade says, to produce the painful impression requires no virtues at all. The more defects a man may have, the more resounding his success. While people can and often do fake pleasure, there are plenty of tortures that are absolutely sure to deliver pain. If I slowly insert a knife into somebody's stomach, I can be quite sure that their screams of agony are a genuine expression of their feelings. I know that this person will be consumed entirely by the desire for the torture to stop. They will be thinking entirely of me. Their mind will be focused on my action and on the desire that I cease the torture. In this way, I will have that person entirely under my will. Contrast that to the case of pleasure, where, maybe I try to bring a woman to orgasm, but she fakes her response and really her mind is elsewhere. Yes, pleasure is not as intense as pain, and pleasure is not as reliably or easily inflicted as is pain. There is a third reason why the infliction of pain provides a greater intensity of pleasure, and that is that by inflicting pain on others, we violate moral conventions. So I mentioned that Sade rejects the distinction between higher and lower pleasures, at least beyond any measurements of intensity and duration. Even so, Sade does recognise that intellectual activity is connected to pleasure. Right, so pleasure, as Sade sees it, is purely mechanical process produced by vigorous movements of voluptuous atoms. But the mind is also mechanical, and with intellectual activity, we may provoke our internal atoms to move more violently. So Sade recommends conversation about libertine activities. He recommends the use of speech during sex, such as to perform blasphemies. These will all produce more violent movements of voluptuous atoms. In general, performing actions that shock other people, simply due to breaking social conventions, will in turn provide a greater shock to our own systems and a greater intensity of pleasure. So insofar as cruelty and brutality are considered morally evil, we attain pleasure from them by breaking taboos. For the same reason, Sade urges the libertine to overcome the disgust response, and he regularly describes eating feces as among the greatest pleasures. Many of his libertine characters seem to think that literally having people shit in your mouth is one of the greatest pleasures you can have. Again, this is something that is breaking social conventions, breaking taboos. So that is the case for the greater pleasure achieved through the infliction of pain and suffering. Now, there is a fairly obvious response to all of this, which is that, well, like even if you grant Sade's views about the sort of structure of the human nervous system and Sade's metaphysics and so on, it remains the case that people have, I guess, moral sentiments, right? So helping other people brings me pleasure, while inflicting pain on others will result in pain for me. And we can accept the view that imposing more intense sensations on others results in more intense sensations in ourselves. But when I inflict pain on others, that just results in greater intensity of pain for myself through feelings of guilt and remorse. I mean, the vast majority of people are going to have these sentiments of sympathy, compassion, benevolence, and at least, I say the vast majority of people have them, I mean the vast majority of people have them at least in certain situations. Maybe these sentiments are not as prevalent as we would like, but clearly people have some capacity for guilt and remorse, and if you go around just like randomly, torturing babies, that's going to provoke a great deal of guilt in many people, and so it will provoke pain for them. The pleasures that Sade describes are simply not accessible to those of us who have such moral sentiments. So in response to this, Sade again appeals to his views about the structure of nature. Sade recognises that humans are indeed motivated by both virtue and vice. He recognises that the majority of people do indeed experience moral sentiments that discourage them from cruelty. But now he distinguishes between those impulses that are natural, those impulses that are universal aspects of human psychology, that are built into us as biological animals, and those impulses that result from social convention. When deliberating about our actions, Sade says we hear two voices. Which voice should we heed? Well, I quote, "The one which speaks first to me is that which will speak the loudest and which I must heed, considering it an authentic because immediate, spontaneous inspiration of nature, whereas the other voice only corrupts and distorts nature's message to me." Sade then argues that it is precisely the vicious impulses that are natural. Greed, lust, cruelty, destruction, these are all built into us by nature. The moral sentiments, such as sympathy and compassion, that lead us to constrain our behaviour for the sake of others, these are inculcated socially. So the claim is that we have certain drives independently of any kind of social inculcation. These drives are entirely self-interested. It is only through indoctrination into particular social conventions that we constrain our drive to self-interest. Why should we believe this? Well, in fact, we can quite easily observe what life is like in a state of nature, outside of civilization. And what we find is savage competition, red in tooth and claw. As Sade says, the wolf devours the lamb, the spider snares the fly, the wild bird steals seeds from furrows ploughed by humans. There is not a single wild animal that has ever respected any moral boundary. All in nature is theft and competition. In the state of nature, you take whatever you have the power to take. So the most basic law of conduct, and law in the sense of natural, law of nature, mechanical law, not in the sense of moral law, but just the most basic kind of drive, most basic principle of conduct bred into us by nature is to take what belongs to others, to steal from them, to devour them, if you have the desire to do so. And as Sade has already argued, humans are no different. Humans are machines, built from the same parts and in accordance with the same laws as all other animals. So in fact, Sade agrees with Hobbes's contention and with the social contract theorists' contention that the state of nature is a state of perpetual warfare. And again, here we see Sade turning the arguments behind social contract theory against the moralist. People are born into the world as enemies in constant conflict. That's our natural state. And this must shape our natural desires, right? Given that this is the state that we are naturally born into, that has to be in concordance with what our desires are. Our most basic drive is to benefit ourselves, and in order to do this, we have to act with violence and cruelty without consideration for the needs of anybody else. Pity, generosity, benevolence, charity, these are all incompatible with life in the state of nature, with life in a state of perpetual warfare. Anybody with those drives would immediately be exploited and killed. Basically Sade says, look, if these were our innate virtues, if we did in fact, if we were in fact furnished by nature with drives to pity and compassion and so on, the primitive state would be totally contrary to what we actually observe. What we observe is that life in a state of nature is one of constant warfare and competition, and that means that the natural drives must be drives to violence, to cruelty. They are self-interested without regard to the suffering that you impose on others. The impulses to violence and cruelty are, of course, constrained and modified by civilization. But even here, the constraining only goes so far. For one thing, Sade thinks we see the impulse to cruelty in babies. I quote, "The infant breaks his toy, bites his nurse's breast, strangles his canary long before he is able to reason." So as infants, humans reveal their violent tendencies. Moreover, even as adults, obeying social rules, Sade says, I quote, "No person exists who in the depths of his heart does not feel the most vehement desire to be rid of those by whom he is hampered, troubled, or those whose death may be of some advantage to him." Indeed, Sade is sometimes tempted towards a kind of psychological egoism. The virtuous, he suggests, are deluding themselves, right? But really they are, just like everyone else, motivated by their own interests. They're motivated by their own interests just as much as the vicious are, because what underlies virtue is really reciprocal exchange. Like, I give unto you in order that I may obtain from you in exchange. But within civilization, people, we still see people being basically self-interested. People are happy as long as they can pursue their own interests, and as long as the laws of society leave them in peace to do as they please. When people exhibit virtuous behaviour, we recognise this as a sacrifice, as a compromise caused by the need to operate in society. When we choose virtuous behaviour, we have to make do with some compensation for the desires we have quashed. And so even here we see that the sort of natural drive is for the strong to exploit the weak, just as it's the natural drive for the wolf to eat the lamb. And we never really remove such drives. While there are these universal drives towards self-interested action and towards violence, across the animal kingdom and across all ages and sexes of humans, moral codes, by contrast, are highly variable. The concepts of virtue and vice, of justice and injustice, are, Sade says, purely local and geographic. So what offends the moral sentiments of one society will be perfectly acceptable in another. And this shows that moral sentiments are a product of social convention, not of nature. In Juliette, Sade gives an extensive list of practices accepted in other cultures that would be considered abhorrent to us. I quote, "On the banks of Orinoco, mothers drown their daughters the moment they see the light. In the kingdom of Zopit and Trapobania, fathers cut the throats of their children of whichever sex, once they grow weary of the sight of them, or when these children begin to take on airs. In Madagascar, all infants born on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Fridays are abandoned to wild beasts by their own parents." This list goes on for several pages, and it's not difficult to look at history and anthropology to find practices of shocking cruelty accepted in other cultures, sometimes cultures very close to our own. Conversely, there are plenty of actions that we accept that would be shocking to others. Homosexuality was a serious crime in Sade's time, but today we tolerate, even embrace, all sexual orientations. Well, maybe not all of them, but certainly homosexuality is embraced. Even the very principles by which we judge actions can vary enormously across cultures. Today, many people tend to be broadly utilitarian, right? Like, most people think that we should organise society so as to promote pleasure and minimise suffering. If you ask the average person why homosexuality is acceptable, I mean, they'd likely say something like, well, what's the harm in it, right? Like, hey, they're not hurting anybody. But obviously we can find societies that take completely different approaches to moral thinking. It's societies where utilitarianism would just be seen as utterly bizarre as a foundation for morality. Virtue ethics, for instance, represents a very different approach to utilitarian thinking. I mean, certainly if you were to talk about morality to someone from, I don't know, ancient Greece, you would find yourself, each of you would find yourselves baffled by the moral views and the overall moral theories that the other adopts. So nature has conferred in us certain drives, particularly the drive to maximise self-interest, and that brings with it the drive to violence and cruelty. When we experience guilt at our own actions, or loathing towards the misdeeds of others, this is a manifestation of the idiosyncratic moral sentiments that happen to be favoured in our own culture. But, Sade says, if from somewhere within us there arises a murmur of protestation against the acts of wickedness that we concert, this voice is nothing whatever but the effect of our prejudices and education, and that if we had been born and raised in some other climate, it would address us in a very different language. So to be clear, so this is a kind of argument from moral disagreement, but the role of the argument from moral disagreement in Sade is not so much as, he's not sort of using this as a direct challenge to moral rules. His point is to demonstrate that moral sentiments, such as pity and sympathy, are inculcated and directed by society, not by nature. These sentiments are not innate. Indeed, they conflict with our innate natural drives by blocking us from pursuing our self-interest and by blocking us from expressing violent impulses. So the person who recognises that morality is groundless and who learns to overcome their moral sentiments will thereby live more authentically. Well, I mean, actually not just, more authentically, but they'll be better able to promote their own pleasure. But, so Sade thinks that in fact, it's not too difficult to overcome such sentiments. He draws an analogy to the food of different cultures. So there are various forms of cuisine that are considered delicacies by those familiar with them, but that we do not have a taste for due to our different upbringing. Think of something like surströmming, which is fermented Baltic herring. It's considered a delicacy in Swedish culture, but is one of the most foul-smelling foods in the world. You can find plenty of YouTube videos of people attempting to eat surströmming and vomiting, although that is actually partly because most people eat it incorrectly. You're not supposed to just eat the fish alone. It's supposed to be eaten with like bread and sour cream and so on. But even so, even if you add the bread and sour cream, a lot of people on first exposure to surströmming might well just start vomiting due to the smell. But the repugnance that we feel towards different foods is often just a matter of unfamiliarity. You know, again, if you'd been born in Sweden, if you'd been born with the right kind of background, you would probably be perfectly fine with surströmming. Maybe not actually. There are probably a lot of Swedish people who don't like it either. But again, even so, right? Like a lot of this is due to unfamiliarity. Similarly, consider genres of music that you initially hate because they sound unfamiliar, but you can come to appreciate with gradual exposure. We can learn to enjoy new and unexpected pleasures. And Sade says, in the same fashion, let us accustom ourselves to evil, and it will not be long before we find it charming. We feel guilty about cruelty because we're not habituated to it. If we make an effort to repeat cruel activities, or perhaps, maybe we should start small with, minor theft and gradually build up to torture and murder, but pretty soon all guilt and remorse will disappear. Just repeat the action enough times and the moral sentiments will be overcome. And then you can delight in the ecstasies that cruelty makes possible. Ultimately, there is a significant difference between my suffering and the suffering of others. I can turn a blind eye to others in a way that I can't to myself. Why am I moved by my own suffering, by my own pains? Well, it's because I feel them immediately, physically, intensely. When I experience hunger, it imposes itself upon me just as a result of my physical constitution, and I can't turn away from it. When I see another person in pain, that may move me, but many other people can see the same thing and not be moved. Like if it's if it's a Jewish person being gassed to death, that would move me, but, show it to a Nazi, they wouldn't care. And suppose that the person in pain is a person I hate, a person who I think has wronged me seriously. Maybe that person previously killed my brother or something. Well, then seeing that person in pain would not move me so strongly. Or perhaps it would move me, but it might move me to pleasure rather than sharing in the pain. I can see the suffering of someone who killed my brother, and maybe I'll be happy about that rather than moved to sympathy. So there is a significant difference in this respect, from my point of view, between my suffering, which I'm always going to be motivated to avoid suffering for myself, but clearly, the suffering of others doesn't impose itself upon us in quite the same way, right? Like we can learn to overcome the sympathies we feel. As Sade says, there is no rational commensuration between what affects us and what affects others. The first we sense physically, the other touches us only morally, and moral feelings are made to deceive. None but physical sensations are authentic. So, with respect to the argument that cruelty should be avoided, that it's in my interest to avoid cruelty because I experience sentiments such as guilt and remorse, Sade asks me to consider, why do I experience such sentiments? And, it looks like the answer to that is, the reason why I have those sentiments is because I have some concern for the welfare of others. If I didn't care about others, if other people just didn't matter to me, if I looked at them as resources, then imposing the most severe cruelty upon you would no more cause me guilt than would cutting down a tree. But it is society, not nature, that drives me to have concern for others. These are not my natural drives. They're not my innate drives. Sade says, nature's single precept is to enjoy oneself at the expense of no matter whom. Moreover, Sade has already argued that all morality is groundless. Once we embrace moral nihilism, we are free to reject social convention and pursue our pleasure at no matter what the cost to anybody else. The feelings of guilt and remorse are the voice of an arbitrary social code without any rational foundation. The person who acts in their own rational self-interest would make an effort to eradicate such feelings so that the greatest pleasures, the ecstasies of cruelty, can become available to them. Okay, that is all I wanted to talk about. Those are some of the views on moral philosophy found in the Marquis de Sade. As I noted at the beginning, there are many other arguments in Sade. Not all of them are compatible with the views presented here, but what I've tried to do is just present what I find to be some of the more interesting and challenging arguments to be found in Sade's work. I may do more videos on him in the future, but yeah, that's all for now. So thank you for watching. Goodbye.